We are live. That's going to be a really fun first live shot there. And we've got Tiffany in there. And don't worry, you're not actually live. It's on a private unlisted video. So nobody's going to see any of this until I share those with you. And because I do have to get our booth set up, unfortunately, I can't stay. But I know you're going to have a great event. So I'm going to turn it over to Tiffany, you guys.
Hi, everybody. I am Tiffany Rose Nickel, or T. R. Nickel. I am an author, game developer, and writer. Some of you who are early got to hear a little bit about this, but I've been in almost every sector of the creative industry, whether that's through like copy, social media work, marketing, web development, up into co-writing, writing in other people's adventures. A bunch of fun stuff like that. So creating is one of my favorite things to do in my whole life, and I made a career out of it. So, and I hope to inspire you guys all. Magic system, world building, creating the thing that we get to play inside is probably my favorite hobby. So I'm very happy to help and inspire, or just get you guys going, rare and being like, I want to do this. So very excited. This is a workshop, so I will call on you. I will obviously hope you guys raise your hands and participate willingly, but it should be a narrative between back and forth. That's how we develop and how we create things, is utilizing the experiences in which we've all shared as humans, right? Waking up in the morning, going to bed, all the similarity things of what our day-to-day life looks like that translate whether into game or into novel. So with all of you, we're creating that collective experience. We want to get to know each other and the stories that are going on inside our heads, right? So, a magic system, right? Probably most of you think fantasy, right? Magic, right? However, the actual definition of a magic system goes beyond just what you would think of Fireball. It actually has more to do around the structurization of rules that exist within a world that allow things that are beyond our understanding or what we have in our real world. So it's more about rules, limitations, and the structure around how do people do the things that they do. So it actually goes far beyond just fantasy. Sci-fi has a magic system. Psychological thrillers have a magic system. Most genres, I think romance, depending on if it's just strict, is probably one of the few genres that don't have a structurized magic system inside of it. If it has to have, this is how the thing works, it's a magic system, right? I wish they changed the word magic into something else, but that's kind of just the definition of it all. With like sci-fi, big example with that is like travel. How do we have these spaceships that are easy to go up, out, into space? How do they dock? How do they dock together if they do that? How do people come in and out of them? We have spaceships in real life, right? We do not have spaceships like they do in Star Wars, where you can easily go in and out of orbit. How does the traffic work with that, right? You have to think about what is the logistics of that? Is there air traffic control, but in space? How do laws work across planets? In our own planet, Mars has a different time clock than what we do. So how does that work? Does someone age slower or faster depending on what planet they are? How does that work coming back, right? All of that is what's considered a magic system, right? It's not just world building of this is how the world works. It's fundamentally, this is the rules of how society exists. This is how things work, right? So it's even more finite and specific towards that. With psychological manipulation, right? Those psychological thrillers, is how does psychology work in your book? Does it go by the fundamentals in which we understand psychology, or do you twist it to allow someone to go beyond just what like Stockholm syndrome is, right? What is the finite of, what is the breaking point of people in your book? Is it systematic across all of them, or is it by character? And is it because they've gone through certain traumatic experiences, or does it delve further into, okay, well, it was because of ABC that works, but that would be systematic across that character, right? So you have to think of what is the finite thing that causes this to work, right? How does this make sense on a large scale across not one character, but 70 billion, right? Whatever that number is in your world, that has to work across that foundation. Even the cultural practices within books and games, that has some type of magic system to it, especially in a fantasy or sci-fi setting. Like, for example, teleportation, right? That exists in both sci-fi and fantasy, but they work fundamentally different, right? One based off of science that doesn't exist, right? We make that up, but it's science. The magic is typically a different form of science, more towards like what we believed alchemy to be back in the day, right? That was a very early form of science, really just transmutation, and it was chemistry. But that was a form in which we tried to understand how one thing became something else, right? And that with teleportation, you have to know the differences between, here's the mathematical equation that caused a propulsor thing to exist. I'm not a scientist, so excuse me. But you have to understand, like, okay, this is how teleportation came to be. Here's the fundamentals of the accident that went wrong, or if that was the case. Or maybe it was people working tirelessly for years, decades, centuries to obtain that. Fantasy, maybe one guy just woke up one day and was like, boom, I became a teleportation circle. I created one. I don't know. But you have to have a fundamental idea of how this thing started, how it works, and how it then was generated after. Magic systems really are up to your imagination. You guys can create whatever magic system you want. You can utilize one that has pre-existed, you know, going off of maybe if you like Brandon Sanderson, right? If you like how he does his magic system, you can utilize those same type of elements and tweak it to become your own, or you can go crazy and just try to come up with something entirely on your own. Either way, it's about the limitations and the ways it occurs is what is the important part of that system. So, I have a question for all of you. How many of you have already started or have like attempted creating some type of magic system, whether that's sci-fi, fantasy? Okay, yeah, awesome. I love to see it. So if you guys have those things in mind, you can absolutely apply what we're going to go through today to your own magic systems that exist. Otherwise, have fun creating one today. Someone yelled at me after one of this because they're like, now I have to write a book. Because they came up with a really cool idea for the sci-fi elemental world where each element had was actually sci-fi, and so like they used it as armor. It was a really cool concept that they built out. But what we're really going to be going through is how we have to think like this is the start, and then by the end, hopefully you all walk away with like a really good magic system. That's my hope for all of you, or feeling inspired to do one. The first thing we have to do is understand the 4 types that break up into a magic system. Now, there's hard magic, soft magic, irrational, and rational. Now, a lot of authors like to categorize, like, I have like hard sci-fi, right, or soft fantasy, or urban fantasy, right? Like, they like to just do that, but what really is happening is it's a grid. So it's not, I'm this, 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 or this. You're more of like, I'm maybe on the irrational but hard side of that system, right? Because the difference between hard and soft is, I know how this thing works, I state how this thing works, we understand how that thing works. Soft is, it happens. This is, people can do things, you know? And that's as much as we know about it. Rational and irrational. Rational is, it makes sense why people can do these things. Brandon Sanderson, I read this one, so excuse me. He created a system where they eat metal, ingest it, they can do things with it, right? That's a hard rational. It's a little up here because he leaves some things unexplained because he's like, I don't want to play with that later. But it's more on that side of the scale because we know how it happens, we know why it happens, and we understand what they're doing with their ability, right? Superman, who I know is a hot take, I hate Superman because of this, is that he is a hard, irrational character. Because we know all of his abilities. We know that he can use X-ray vision. We know he can fly. We know he has super strength. But none of that correlates with each other. None of that makes sense of why he's able to do all those things, right? And it's never explained. He's Superman. That's what people do, and that's what makes it irrational, right? It makes sense that he has all these, he has all these things. We know he has all these things, but it doesn't make sense why he has all these things. And also, why a rock is his greatest enemy. That's what gets me the most. But that's kind of the grid that we're working on. So you can go hard, down the line is soft, that's your one axis, and then the other, it's rational and irrational. Now, I like to play on the side of hard and slightly irrational. And the reason why I go slightly is because I want people to be able to think for themselves in my books, right? I want them to try to figure out, do I know everything how it works? Absolutely. Do my readers need to know everything about that? No. They don't, because I want them to have that creativity and be able to imagine it in their own mind in the way that they see it. That's more fun to me. That's the books that I enjoyed reading. But as a writer, you should know the most rational and the most hard side of it. But that doesn't mean it has to translate into that book or into that game setting, right? So with some of you who have already started your creation of magic, what would you say is your scale of hard, soft, rational, irrational? And you can be honest, there's not a wrong answer. There's a reason why it's a grid. It's not you have to do this in order for it to be good. I just don't like Superman because he's allergic to a rock. And he's like the most powerful human on the planet. Or not human, but being to exist.
I'd say hard, trying to go rational, but still trying to piece that together. And everything. That's the challenge, at least for me, is how do I make it to where it makes sense to me and makes sense without giving away the ghost, I guess.
Absolutely.
I want soft, rational, because I want the psychics
Okay.
game, but you don't have to know why psychics do what they do.
That's very true.
You know what I mean?
They just do what they do. Exactly.
But
Yeah.
out of curiosity, how is a game system anything but irrational? Right? Because if you want it to be playable by people and understandable, it has to have that rational component. Otherwise, how does a player know what they do?
Yeah. So I mean, the thing is, irrational is just how it makes sense, right? A wizard is a pretty good example of maybe irrational, unless there's a school category, right? Like we in Dungeons and Dragons, right? There's necromancy or thaumaturgy or whatever, there's categories to it that exist to help specify why they're able to cast these spells more effectively. But what doesn't make sense is if you have the conjuration school, but then you're casting something like polymorph. That doesn't make sense, right? So that's actually pretty irrational. It would make sense to fireball, it's a conjuration, summoning an elemental, that's conjuration. Those type of classifications would make a lot of sense because they're all within that same type of category. But the moment you exit and suddenly they're casting something like thaumaturgy, right? And precipitation. However you say that word. But if you were to do that, suddenly it's irrational, right? As a player, though, or as a GM, you can make it rational by giving it a backstory, by giving context to it, right? But again, that's why I do irrational. I know the rationality of why things exist in my world, but my readers don't need that. As players, most people don't realize that they're actually probably playing irrationally, but they could make it rational by giving it context. Maybe your wizard went to a bunch of different towers with master wizards, right, to learn different schools of magic. So it's one of those little nuances that allow it to be rational or irrational in that sense. Anyone else who would like to share? I see you.
I know. Mine is just the beginning of a concept
That's okay.
on how I'm doing this, but I have it set up to where the mortal world is new.
Okay.
So then there are these three groups.
Mm-hmm.
I'm kind of reinventing, not necessarily Fae, but the way I'm breaking it up. But the only way the mortals can get magic is if one of the beings from one of the sections.
Yeah.
Not this. It's not warlock, but
It's more of
you're
like a
attached
deity.
to them type of thing.
Yeah.
So that's the only way it's gonna work.
And
So I don't know. And
Yeah.
like I said, this is just beginning
The
concepts.
beginnings,
I'm
yeah.
still.
that's the perfect time to be thinking about it. And because you have to think, okay, how much do I need to know to be able to present to your readers, your players, whichever you're using this for? That's the perception of it is probably really important because that will give you the basis of how much you need to know, right? I'm obsessive. I spent 5 years building my worlds and magic systems and all of that for my books because that is just me. You don't need to do that, and in fact, I recommend don't. Just write, do the thing. Don't spend time playing in your own head. But for you, think about, okay, what do I? Is it for a book or for a game, or just for yourself?
It is right now kind of for myself. I'm creating from like the creation and then
Yeah.
how that and the way things are, and I'm just at the very beginning of this. So I have it. So like with fairies or fae, you have the ceiling and you have the
Yes.
unceiling. And D&D, you have the Feywild and you have the Shadowfell.
Right.
But I have this broken to where you have like this light, you have this darker, but then from the boring,
Mhm.
a group broke off and they're kind of a shadow. So it's like these three Venn diagram, then with the mortal
sure, where they all-
in the center. And
Yeah. Totally get it. Yeah. So with that, you just have to think, if I was looking at this, what would I need to know to make sense of the world? How would I to play in it? Whether like I want to just imagine myself as a character in this world, I want to read it about this world, or I want to play in this world. Think about the perception of what it is I would need to know to have it make sense, and then backtrack from there. Because obviously, the more you know about how things work, the better and more often you can play with anything, right? You can make it as irrational, rational, hard, and soft as you want. But if you're like, I don't want to spend 5 years on this thing trying to make it as hard and as rational as possible in my own brain, just think about what is the bare minimum someone we need to know to look at this thing and understand how the world works, and backtrack probably at least 20% from that, because you want to know more than what any perception would provide you. And then that's what makes it like a rule book or an index, a glossary in a book. So we're gonna go over the key elements now of a magic system, and this is where you can really start to like build out your magic system. So the first thing you have to really start to consider is the source of the magic, like deities, right? You have to think, where does the source, or how does one obtain magic? Is it something like scientific, you have to study, you become a scientist, or is it readily available? Can you buy and purchase equipment? Can you get a spaceship? Can you easily access, communicators that allow you to talk to someone on Mars? How does someone do the thing that you're wanting them to do? How does that fundamentally work in society, right? Are people born with magic, or is it something people learn? Is it both? You have to start to fundamentally think of, okay, this is the basis. How did this thing come to be, right? Like we talked about, the starting point. With yours, where is that starting point for you?
So for me, a majority of the magic is actually the deities creating the world impart themselves to everything that they create. Therefore, that magic is innate in everybody. The knowledge of it, or even the fact that they're using it, isn't necessarily tied to anything. It's more they believe they create stories, and these stories essentially intertwine themselves into reality.
Like Inkheart?
I'm not familiar.
It's a book where everything in the story comes true.
Okay.
Yeah, I love it. We need a new one, so I do that. It's a long time since we have one like that. But yeah, you have a source of, okay, this is how the thing at least begins. Like, this is where the essence, right, starts. Like in my world, for example, it all started with the All-Mother, who's like a massive deity that was the universe. She was all of existence, and she was lonely, and so she decided to be cruel and create things, right? And through that creation process, she created her daughters, who were the other goddesses of the pantheon, each of them representing a type of mental state, if you will, but also geared towards a fraction of the material plane that exists for them all to create, and for them to feel less lonely in their existence, right? And through that, the doorways to each of these deities and the pantheon seeps into the world in order to give magic to it, right? Now, what happens when these doorways close? The magic source is cut off, but it still lingers, right? It lingers in heritage, and lingers in items that were once used by these deities or gifted by these deities. So you have to think, this is the whoa up here, starting point, and how it trickles down into a narrative, right? Whether that's in a game setting or in. With your mediums, what is, even if with it being, you said irrational, right?
Yeah.
Yeah. Where is that starting place for you of
I just said it was largely genetic. And
Yeah.
There's a group of people that ended up being experimented on and diffusely, which would be players, because every player wants to be a psychic.
yeah, why not? Yeah. That's perfect. That's exactly it. So even in rational systems, they have a base starting point, right? And as long as you can find a source of where this thing exists, right? How does it all begin? You know, maybe R.L. Stein, Goosebumps, maybe his books somehow seep out into the world, and now we have all these creepy crawling monsters. Well, how did that happen? Well, some toxic sludge fell on a book and did something to it, right? So there has to be just like a starting point that begins. And he has a great masterclass. If you haven't taken it and are interested in how to write stories like that, you should. It's a really good one. Rules and limitations. This is my favorite one. Because I like to have a structure of how things work. Right? If you haven't guessed by this point in my speech, when I talk a lot about rules, like this is how it has to work. The importance of limitations is to like maintain the tension for your characters, right? If people were omnipotent, right, and just able to do whatever they want anytime they want, that's not a really fun game, and that's also not a fun story to read, right? Some people really do like the overpowered, like One Punch Man, you know that anime. He one punches everybody. I cannot stand an anime like that because I like the consequences of actions. I like flaws. And he's just like, he may be dumb as a doornail, but he's still way too strong for what that is. So with things like that, you have to think, okay, people can do the thing, right? This is how it starts. This is how we know it began. People have psychic abilities. But what are the rules around that? Right? What is there components, right? Like a ship, right? I've been playing Outlaws by Star Wars. If you haven't played that game, love it. I know it got terrible reviews. Shocking. I love that game. Played it twice. It is a game where you literally collect components, and Kate is the main character. She levels up as you play the game, as you train her, right? You actually have to accomplish certain tasks in order to get better at shooting a gun, right? How interesting is that, right? But it sets real clear rules and limitations to a character. Now you can overcome and go beyond those rules and limitations as you experience things. But it creates a real good foundation of this is your path, this is how someone does a thing. And it can be different for each character, right? Because you have someone who's an engineer in a book and is trying to build the first ever time ship, right? Or like, you know, go back in time and time travel and all that. They're gonna have to start from somewhere and get somewhere in order to do that, right? How do they do that? Is it through training? Is it through collaboration? Is it through mystic, like do they find some type of mystic ability like the Force that allows them to understand things on a more cosmic level? What are those, just what is the thing that allows that path? Those are the rules and limitations of it. With limitations, there's typically like the thought of a cost to it. Of, I overuse my magic, now I die, right? I accidentally crossed the blue and red wire, now it blew up, right? There has to be if there's a limit, there has to be a thing that forces that limit, right? I mean, physical capability is a real hard limit, right? I can't run 10 miles. Could I train to do that? Yes. But it is just because my body is not a thing that I can't run 10 miles, right? That is just my limitation. There's no cosmic reason behind the fact that that's not something I could do, right? You can do things like that that it just makes sense, right? To our everyday life, that would make sense. You can't jump up a building from the ground floor, you know, like, can't jump over it. But other limitations are really important, especially with people who have abilities. Like a wizard has only so many slots, right, to cast their spells. Exhaustion, MP, right? There needs to be a clear reason why you can't go past that point. So who would like to share perhaps a rule or limitation that they could apply to their own magic system to help refine and create that tension for their characters, for their players? Come on, I will call on someone.
I got limitations, sure, right? Because I'm doing side gigs.
Right.
The point is, you can push yourself as hard as you want,
Mm-hmm.
but you risk your mind, right? So sanity was my limitation.
Ooh, I love that.
So
Love
yeah,
that.
you just roll dice, and you could try and do stuff like instead of telekinesis one person, telekinesis a whole room full of people.
Sure.
But you risk more sanity, and you roll for it along with actually rolling to do your thing.
Yeah, I love that. It sets a clear reason why you wouldn't just do something. Yeah, exactly. Yeah, and that's what it's about. It's about finding that clear, logistically, why someone would cross it. Now, there's opportunities that someone would, right? Desperate need. Maybe they're just literally insane. They're like, I want to do this thing to test it. You know, like but there's a clear definition. There's, you know, like in bowling, when you have the guardrails up. That's what we're looking at. Okay. They're the ones bowling. You need to set up the guardrails of how that thing works, right? They can still bounce around, but they're going to hit their objective regardless of that, right? The next thing we'll talk about is accessibility. So you said heritage, right? They were experimented on. So who has access to it, right? So we know already with your magic system who those people are, right? So you have to think about that on a large scale too, right? On a societal basis, like, is it accepted, right? Is this something that they're going to struggle with? Is this something that a mass population has, that it's kind of normal? How easy is it to obtain? Like, could I go to a store and buy a magic crystal and suddenly I can cast something? Like a scroll, right? There's scrolls in a lot of games that allow you to temporarily, one-time utilize this thing, right? But you think about, okay, if I wanted this character who has no magical innate ability to suddenly exist within the confines of a magical group, how do they do that? Maybe they borrow the power. Maybe there's a watch that exists that makes them look like they're part of like bionic group, you know? It injects the serum that
And this is where you get into the high fantasy low fantasy.
Huh? Exactly, yeah. How extreme, really, is it going to go? And you have to set that up, right? Harry Potter, an example of like urban fantasy, right? It still exists in some type of high fantasy because there is a realm which doesn't exist within our world, but it still plays a lot on what, J.K. Rowling called muggles, right? Humans. They still had a very intricate and role that existed and why magic existed in the way that it did. A lot of people argue in that fandom of why would wizards just take over, right? They're obviously going to be more powerful, but when you actually look on how wizards live their everyday life in a book like that, they live years behind what we do technology-wise. They don't have cell phones, they use owls, right? They don't have dishwashers, they use a brush that magically goes like this in the sink.
That's an interesting concept with the whole magic system is, if magic existed in the world, how would our technology and our advancement actually be different, right?
Exactly.
It's easy to light the fire like this, why would I ever need to discover flint and tinder?
Mm-hmm.
Sort of situation.
Yeah. How does that limit it too, right? Like, do we as humans, like WALL-E, right? And that, I think it's a funny correlation because you're like, this is a real serious thing, and I'm like, WALL-E. But in reality, they got those chairs, right, that allowed them to carry all throughout the spaceship versus walking. And it literally hindered their way of life, right? They couldn't physically do anything that we as humans are able to do. So as technology advances too, it can limit. Magic can limit how we advance in technology. But really, as the creator, you just have to think of why that is. With J.K. Rowling, Harry Potter, for example, there's a big separation between the magic community and muggles. That's why they have like the ministry that focuses solely on studying muggle items or why muggles do things. They think, wizards think the muggles are weird for using the stuff that they use. And humans don't even know wizards exist, right? But that's just the logic in which she used in that book to be like, they wouldn't take over because they won. They think it's all weird what they do over there. They think the way that they're doing it is the right way. And it's a societal view. Same with cultures even in our own world, right? The way that we do things here is very different than how they do things in like Europe even, right? Like the work-life balance difference is very dramatic from there, right? So you just think of it from that perspective. But that's such a good point of it can hinder, it can change fundamentally how a group of people evolves. It's just how does that work in your world? How does that work in your system? With accessibility too, thinking about like the training aspect of that. So like let's say someone's born with it or they can learn it on a base level. What are the things that they need to accomplish to be able to be good at that thing? Right? So I love a good training montage where they're like fighting with swords and and you see them like slowly get better and make sense why suddenly now they can do like a sweet like flip in the air and slice someone, you know? But you just have to think fundamentally, right? How would every wizard that to ever exist be able to get to level 1 to level 20? Right? EXP, milestone, that's how they do it a lot in games. But what causes that? Fighting monsters, accomplishing tasks, goals that would allow them to use their skills. That's how essentially they grow and how they train and how they learn. In a novel, you could think about it as like they have to use their ability to learn. Maybe they have to find someone who is better already. Maybe they have to find certain tools that enhance their magic. Like they have to resonate with something, right? But how you just have to think, what are the rules around how does someone get better and grow from where they are? And what is the strain?
So on that, what do you think about like between the like a dichotomy between the rational and irrational. So like Wheel of Time.
Mm-hmm.
Now I forget their names, but
You're
the women that can cast magic.
Aes Sedai.
Aes Sedai. They're pulling from the one source, but they have levels of power. They're like, you have to train for it. You have to. These ones have to move their hands. These ones don't have to move their hands. You
Right.
can just think about it. But then, and that's a very rational system for at least development of it. But then there are some that are just they're just more gifted, and so they will. There's other ones in there that will never reach level 20.
Yeah.
But then these other ones are like, you're already starting off at level
Yeah.
6 at the beginning. Sort
Yeah.
of situation.
So that would be
Is that
hard.
a dichotomy or?
It would be hard irrational, right? Because it would make sense that people who maybe have a stronger connection, like we know why the thing exists, but we don't understand how one person could be better than the other, right? Unless I haven't read, it's too intimidating for me right now to read that series. But if they don't explain, right, how one gets better or more connected with this source that would allow them to improve, then it's irrational.
Okay.
But it's hard because you understand fundamentally why magic exists, why they're able to do the thing that they do. It just doesn't make sense at how they actually obtain that.
Okay.
So there's that level of like, I get it, like we know what thing is, but we don't quite understand how it works. Yeah. So I would say it's more like that. And kind of what we were talking about too, about like wizard classes. It's that same thing. It's like, how can they do two things? Like, could be rational, but it also could be irrational. So they could easily explain, if they say in that series, if at some point they go, people who are of this bloodline just have stronger connection. That makes it rational.
Midi-chlorians.
Yes.
Star Wars Episode 1 is the thing that.
That's what
Yes,
exactly
yeah.
That's what, okay.
Right? It's, yeah. It can be explained if they want it to be explained, but in reality, we kind of just accept it, right? That's why it's not right or wrong. You can be irrational, you can be rational in a story or in a setting. That doesn't really matter. It's just how you want it to be perceived, right? You can have hard and irrational, even though those two things you'd be like, that doesn't make any sense how that works, but it does. Like, I think people have a natural perception of how things work. And we think in these type of rule sets. We understand everyone has flaws, limitations. Everyone has a way of they get better. For all of us as humans, we want to get better at something. We study it, we learn it, we practice it, right? What is that, 10,000 hours is what makes you a master at a craft? That's our rules and our limitations as humans. I wish we had metachlorians. We could use the Force or have some magical crystal that we could absorb power from. That would be really fun. But that's a good example. Now I'm more intrigued. I want to read it because I like it when there's that little like, this is how magic works, but we don't quite understand why.
But how much edification do you think your readers get from the fact there's just a limitation? Like, I'll never be Jordan, for instance.
Sure,
I could play this book forever, right?
Right.
So how does that translate to just enjoyability? Whether it's reading a book or playing a game, like, you'll just never be that guy.
Yeah, you'll never be that guy. I think it's a lot of it's hope, you know, and that's why I like to keep things a little rational because it allows people to fundamentally think, well, there's a possibility, right? Maybe there's a way that we could find a way to do this thing better, be better, get to that point. All of us do the thing because we have hope that we're going to get better at this thing, right? Any person who goes after a creative career, they want to be a giant like R.L. Stein or J.K. Rowling or Brandon Sanderson. We all have the hope of, we're going to get there, we're going to be the white whale. The 0.1% of the 1% that exists in the world of people who write books, right? That's the hope, right? So I think as humans, we have a lot of that. And that's why human stories typically are the ones that people resonate more with. So I think as long as you can portray, like, even if it's impossible, even if it's a hard rational, I cannot obtain this level, right? You can't become a god in books, right? Some of them, anyway. Yeah. But I want the power of one. Why not have fun trying? Okay, think about that. That would be super fun to read. even play as a game. A heist or like some type of goal to achieve godhood and you fail miserably because it wasn't possible to begin with, you still had fun along the way. So maybe just not tell them it's impossible right away, right? Give them that hope factor.
So kind of in that vein of, I'm not Jordan, I will never be Jordan. You brought up Brandon Sanderson, and he does a great job in several points of breaking his own rules.
Yeah.
The only way from like a structural writing it and kind of foundational that I've seen is he's not necessarily breaking his rules. He just didn't tell you
What
didn't
the
get
rules
the full
were.
script. Is there anything beyond that, or is that just kind of the
That's
core
the
of
irrational
Okay.
portion, right? That's why you keep it. Like, especially in fantasy, I feel like you just should always have a little more irrational because it allows you to play. You know, like if you change your mind of how a system works, you're like, well, I never told you.
Yeah, you
That's
haven't
how
painted
it works.
yourself in the corner.
Yeah, so I was like, he breaks rules in the sense that, like, you're like, I did not expect that to work the way that it did, right?
Yeah, but he like alludes to it a little bit, but just doesn't give you the actual
Right.
information. So,
That's why there are like the solid 4 categories, but I'm like, this is a grid. It can't, they play around with each other way too much for it to be like, I am this one thing. Like you need to understand if you're rational or irrational while also be knowing if you're on the hard or soft scale, right? That's a good one. And you can break, I will say this, with all the rules and limitations that we're talking about in the structure, it's okay to break the rules when it makes sense. Because there are outliers in our society, even in our world. People that overcome impossible odds. Like a mother lifting a car, right, to save someone, right? That happens. Logically, that should not be a thing that someone can do, but it can happen. So in those instances where it makes sense, your character, whether it's player or, or in a book, if their back is against the wall and everything they love, everything they cherish, everything that makes them who they are is suddenly at stake. In a moment like that, it is reasonable that they could break the rule. They could go beyond the limitation and not maybe suffer the consequence or cost. So I want to say that, right? Because I know I talk a lot about like, this is how things are. But there are situations where you can go beyond that. The next thing we're going to talk about is consequences. So this goes beyond just what you think of like a cost of magic. What I mean consequence is what we kind of were touching on a little bit about society, right? How does this user, how does the society, how does the environment change because of what you're doing? Now we all know fundamentally, psychologically, right, that everything that's ever been created has already existed before. That it's all based off of something that already has happened or will happen. A fun little mind twist that we that we are as humans, because we're all interconnected in some way or another. That's how we've grown as societies, how we've developed, how people across an entire world understand the concept of a dragon yet never discussed it with one another. Right? We base almost everything off of what we see in every day. There is no one thing that isn't inspired by something you've gone through, you've seen in your real life. So when you think about it like that, when you're creating societies, when you're creating that change, when you're creating or developing the consequences of a world that exists, you know that fundamentally it's starting with the one that we live in right now. And it's just going up from there. So if you look at how our society exists, and this is like the low level when you're first creating anything in a world. What happens when that first person makes the change? My Hero Academia, another anime, right? The kid that was the first one to light up. He had a superpower that allowed him to, he was just a ball of light. It changed society, it broke it. Suddenly that there was something different, right? X-Men, mutants, right? It broke and changed society. It became a political thing too. It made the world think differently on armed defenses, how they protect themselves. And we have to think about that through our magic systems as well. Is how would that build from the perspective of how do we protect ourselves from a fireball, like a bunch of mages coming together and just wanting to decimate a city. Right? We're running out of time, guys. I'm sorry. But you have to think about those ethical implications as well, right? In my book series, we have the magical gathered, which is essentially like people who are forcibly enslaved to become a army for a country, right? Because they had magic abilities, and there's the reduction, right? So magic is being exuded from the world. People are being less and less people are being born with magic. So there's less casters, there's less magical items that are being available, and so countries start hoarding the wealth, right? So they create these gatherings, these assemblies of magic users, as essentially as their army. What's the ethical dilemma of that, right? Right? And you have to think about, okay, so if you have a magic user who isn't a part of that, but is being recruited, right? That type of narrative, that type of story. I want to quick open it up for you guys to ask questions, because we are pretty much at that time limit. But if you guys do have questions, yes, no?
Can you dive like too deep into the details of the world? Like I know myself, not just with the magic system,
Yeah.
but sometimes with the society,
Mm-hmm.
where I start like, and this probably comes from maybe me personally wanting everything to be very rational and
Right.
where it's like I want to explain why is this acceptable, and why, like, is there a point where you're like that's too much, or like how do you check yourself where you're like, I've got enough, let me go back to the actual purpose,
yeah,
the story,
the reason of
or
it.
the system.
Yeah, I mean, like I said, I spent 5 years building out my world. A terrible example.
Yeah.
I have about like 5,000 to 6,000 years worth of history for a world that you will likely only ever see 500 of that. But what really comes down to it, I have another course that I do where I talk about like the fundamentals of actually world building and the limitations that you need to set on yourself when developing it. And it's you have to answer certain categories, really. Because once you have the basics of, and there's a lot, and you have to delve into them, but once you have like the basic understanding of that, everything else you do is for you and to help you have a better understanding of the world that you're going to be writing or playing in. And everything else that's all that the characters, the players, the readers would need to know in order to enjoy and fundamentally understand that story. So that's a whole nother hour, that question. But yeah, so there's things like that that'll help you limit you. I was like, I could probably just send you, if you stop at the vendor hall, I can give you those categories. Because I have like a little worksheet and stuff, but yeah. All right, well, thank you guys so much. I appreciate you coming.
We'll be stopping by. I do have questions, but I also have
Perfect.
Cthulhu at 10, and I'm like, okay.
Yes, run.